Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the Tartary Army Corps. In this video, we're talking about who Tartary Army Corps are, how they play, what are their strengths, weaknesses, and factional identity, before jumping as usual into Infinity Army to go through many of the profiles that showcase this faction. Before we begin, two sets of thanks. Firstly, thank you to all of the channel members who voted for this video topic. I've begun doing polls now to see what the channel supporters are interested in seeing, and if you'd like to support the channel and be able to vote in those polls, you can do so by becoming a channel member on YouTube. However, a second thanks also goes out to friend of the channel, Kerez. They've been mentioned on the channel before, but I've been picking their brain about Ariadne in general and Tartary Army Corps in specific for some time now, and to be perfectly frank, without their input I would know a lot less about this faction than I presently do. They were beating their head against the Ariadne wall when the faction was considered bad, and finding some very interesting ways to play the faction, and they're presently beating their head against the Cosmoflot wall, which is a faction that, despite significant improvements, is probably still the trickiest to play of all Ariadne. Right now, however, we're talking about the Tartary Army Corps, and Tartary are one of the beneficiaries of the October 2025 update, which has really strongly established their identity as a faction that fights from a position of defensive strength. And in thinking about how I was going to present this video, this was actually something that was kind of difficult for me to fully articulate just via speech. And so in order to really fully explain what it is that makes the Tartary Army Corps' defenses so good, behold, my triangle. Now, this kind of visualization is a topic on which we could almost do an entire video. If you'd like that as a topic, by the way, please post in the comments below. But in short, this is a very rough conceptualization of many of the ways in which defenses in Infinity can be good. What makes a good kind of defense, and what are the archetypes of defense in Infinity? And so I've basically conceptualized three sort of fundamental properties that you can ascribe to good defensive pieces, and most good defensive pieces will sit either at one of these points or somewhere along the line between them. So the 3 points of this triangle are, firstly, concealment and materiel. This is stuff like mines and marker states and deployables and the general fog of war you get from having, in particular, lots of marker states out on the table. The thing about concealment and materiel is that it doesn't fight the enemy directly, unlike the other 2 points of the triangle, but it does confuse the opponent and sap their orders and resources without risking your troops. Now, the other 2 points of the triangle are where you fight your opponent, and this is indirect defenses and direct defenses. Direct defenses are your traditional hard arrow. This is firepower directed either at the enemy or where the enemy wants to go. Things like total reaction bots, powerful linked troopers, etc. Any big gun that rolls good dice in ARO is a powerful direct defense, and on the other side of the triangle from that we have indirect defenses. These are your traditional soft AROs, and these are things that directly affect the enemy without seeing them, usually in zone of control, and this is your stuff like hacking and ferroware and jammers. Now, the reason why we call these hard and soft arrows respectively is kind of a nod toward the idea of a hard or soft kill. A hard kill from your direct defenses is likely to injure or incapacitate your opponent by killing them, rendering them unconscious. Your indirect defenses are much more likely to inflict states like isolated or immobilized that stall your opponent out and inflict mobility kills without necessarily killing the opponent directly, although there are a very small number of things like ferroware that can occasionally do that. Then, in between those three corners, you've got things that share those qualities. Models like Noctifers or Swiss missile launchers or Dalami or tank hunters are kind of ambush firepower pieces that both have powerful concealment benefits, but also then impact the enemy by engaging them directly and ideally inflicting casualties. On the other side of the triangle, then, we've got things like ambush and forward info war, where you've got stuff like camouflaged hackers and deployed repeaters out in the midfield that have to be engaged and destroyed, but which often are just materiel, for example, in the case of deployed repeaters, and so which share the quality of sapping your opponent's orders without risking your troops because they are projecting your indirect defenses forward. And then finally, along the bottom line of the triangle, we have models that are doing things like dodging in zone of control in order to get annoying positions, maybe engage in melee. Old school Taiga creatures were very much this kind of piece, where they would burrow their way into a corner somewhere up the field, and you knew that if you approached them, they would start making dodges that would then take them into a position where they would be an annoying direct defense. But ultimately, any kind of dug-in model sort of occupies a position somewhere along this bottom line. Okay, cool. That's a rough idea of how to think about different kinds of defenses in Infinity. Why is this relevant to Tartary Army Corps? And it's relevant to Tartary Army Corps because they occupy basically the entire right side of the triangle with incredible strength. Tartary Army Corps have possibly best in class or very close to best in class in the entire game in terms of both the material and camouflaged elements that they can spew out onto the board, occupying space everywhere from your deployment zone all the way up to the infiltration line, and some of the best in class direct defenses in the game, which sit and emplace themselves and are absolutely dangerous enough to inflict casualties on the opponent and are resilient and which can be force reconstituted easily. Which means collectively that the experience of fighting against Tartary Army Corps is to consistently have to engage one of the game's most resilient gun batteries through a minefield. And it's absolutely critical that we don't understate how much of a big deal this is, because if you think about what is demanded of a list in Infinity, it's very common that a scenario will make a variety of different demands. You might need specialists or the ability to complete classifieds or some mobility, or need to be able to score kills against dug-in models somewhere on the table. There are all sorts of things that a scenario demands of you, but the game Infinity always demands that you're able to defend yourself and frustrate your opponent's ambitions. It is a universal requirement regardless of scenario, and the fact that Tartary Army Corps is good at it means that they always have a strength that they can play to, kind of regardless of the circumstances. And that is just incredibly valuable. And from my perspective, is their primary strength as a faction. But there's a lot that they have that then plays to that. And so, with this really powerful defensive baseline, what else does Tartary do that's cool? Well, they've got fantastic skirmishers and camouflage elements. As I mentioned, a Tartary list is likely to have camouflage everywhere from their deployment zone up to the infiltration line, and those camouflage markers will conceal an absolute host of things. Good guns, decoys, different kinds of mines, specialists. In any given Tartary Army Corps list, there's a very reasonable chance that somewhere on the field there'll be camouflage markers that are concealing nothing, and EM mines, and AP or shock mines, and midfield specialists, and some very dangerous gunfighters, including both Scout Ohotniks and, which we'll absolutely get to, the formidable Army Corps Tank Hunter autocannon. And that depth of things that camouflage markers can conceal increases the value of every camouflage marker, because your opponent needs to account for the fact that, of course, based a little bit on where it's deployed, that thing might be a mine or might be a gun. And most of those guns have got very impressive range bands and are very dangerous even to heavy infantry or possibly tags. And so the camo game for Tartary Army Corps, the shell game that they play and the things that they conceal with the camouflage markers, is again amongst best in class in the game. Now, if you're not relying heavily on camouflage to move around, they've also got quite good visibility control. They've got access to some good smoke grenades and smoke grenade launchers. It's a faction that will generally have a fairly healthy order pool. Not high watermark, not lots of tactical awareness, but most of your list will generally be regular. You should have relatively few irregulars. You'll usually have command tokens to convert those orders if you need, and it's pretty common to have a strategos lieutenant leading the force. Now, this isn't a lot of orders, but it's a healthy count, and Tartary Army Corps are fairly good at spending those orders. There are a lot of pieces that are kind of efficient in their order expenditure, either because they're a specialist or a gunfighter already in the midfield, or because they're mobile, or both. And a really good way to play Tartary Army Corps is to set yourself some objectives you want to accomplish each turn. Think about the orders that you'll need to spend to accomplish those objectives, over budget a little, and then any spare orders that you've got, you spend on your other order outlets. And these are going to be things like using deployables. Mine dispensers in particular are very good in Tartary Army Corps, and spec fire. And by the way, the spec fire in Tartary Army Corps is worth talking about. Now, for long-time Infinity players, me ranting about spec fire is going to have much the same energy as like a 39-year-old telling you about their high school academic achievements, but hear me out. Because the speculative fire that Tartary Army Corps and other parts of Ariadne have access to is genuinely very powerful. We will absolutely talk about this in more depth when we get to things like the tractor mule and tractor mule couriers. But these artillery pieces, in addition to having guided, and you can use forward observer in the good old Ariadne guided play, these are pieces with good ammunition types and positive range bands or zero range bands out to very forgiving ranges. And especially the fact that they're firing double action ammunition, usually on fairly serviceable numbers by specfire standards, means that if you can budget just 2 or 3 orders in a given turn, you are very likely to accomplish multiple things over the course of a game. And that's good not just because having a productive order outlet for your last order in a turn is valuable, but because remember, we are fighting from a position of defensive strength. We want to really force our opponent to expend themselves on and engage those defenses. And if we are attacking them with guided fire or with spec fire, then their options are either to weather that and just accept that they'll sustain casualties over the course of the game, often to things that they really don't want to lose, or to come and attack our dug-in positions, either of which plays into our hand. And so when we're thinking about this faction, if you weren't already, adopt the mindset of the based and Katusha pilled player and be prepared to both think about Specfire as a material part of your Tartary army core lists, right? Think about them as an artillery faction and structure your turns in a way where you can make use of that. Now, these are overall some fairly impressive strengths, particularly the defensive strengths of Tartary Army Corps, but it is a faction that balances those with some really significant limitations. This is still an Ariadnan faction. That means there's a long list of things that we just kind of accept not having access to. Almost no hacking and certainly no network projection. No MSV2s, no cubes, no mimetism -6, no albedo, no hidden deployment, no combat jump. We kind of accept all of these as limitations. And certainly as of October 2025, the strengths of the factions more than compensate for those things, missing things. Now, Tartary also isn't a brute force like Link and Fire Teams faction. You can build some serviceable gunfighting and specialist fire teams. They are either expensive or fragile. It isn't a strength of the faction. You are much more often going to be using your fire teams for utility and support and defensive positions. It's also a faction that is lacking parachutist deployment zone, which is kind of feeble as far as complaints go, but it is worth noting that that's something that many other Ariadnan factions have access to. Finally, this is a faction with kind of a small overall roster. Now, that's by no means the end of the world, but it is worth noting that the model list for Tartary Army Corps, right, there are 30 regiments in this faction, and it isn't hard to glance around at factions that have a lot more than that. Kestrel has 40 regiments in it, Bakunin has 48, for example. And so this does produce kind of an environment where, yep, you're going to expect to see Tartary Army Corps to use quite a lot of the same, if not profiles, then certainly regiments on a repeated basis, and look to get as much use as it can out of the different profiles within those regiments in order to experience some list versatility. And so overall, looking at those strengths and limitations, we can see how Tartary Army Corps is positioned since October 2025. They are a faction that fights from a position of incredible defensive strength and then goes on the offense with a combination of camo, including camouflaged guns, and warbands, and deployable equipment and speculative fire, but generally doesn't seek to engage the enemy in a fair way or engage in kind of like symmetrical conflict, except to the extent that it's got those powerful defensive pieces. That is to say, in short, this is my kind of faction. And I have spent a significant portion of the last fortnight doing a bunch of modeling conversions to let me play it more effectively, and it is seriously on my shortlist of factions to take to my next satellite event. And with the note that that is amongst the most glowing recommendations I can give, let's jump into the army roster and look at some units. Now, as usual, we're going to start with our link teams, and in particular with our line infantry link, but with the caveat that the traditional kind of fire teams are not really where Tartary Army Corps' strengths lies. You do need a single line Kazakh to form a line Kazakh fire team, but the profiles here really are very supplementary. This is not a Fennec Fusilier style regiment. We are really only interested in a couple of profiles here. You can absolutely take a line Kazakh lieutenant for 9 points. If you do, take a decoy. 18 points, willpower 13 lieutenant, and you're sorted. Excellent. And very occasionally you will run either a forward observer or a paramedic if your lieutenant is otherwise obvious, that is to say you're taking Veronin, and you just want to be able to form a line Kazakh fire team. We are not interested in the HMG, we're not interested in the missile launcher. These guys are just link team glue, an occasional lieutenant and an occasional specialist, and that's totally fine. Nothing wrong with using a single line Kazakh fire team built around a single line Kazakh to get slightly better things force multiplied up, but that's really all we're using these guys for. We'll see exactly one of them in the list at the end of the video for exactly that purpose, and that's pretty standard as far as Tartary Army Corps lists go. Now, in terms of getting an actual gun into a line Kazakh fire team, we've got basically two options, the most common of which will be the Frontovik Separate Assault Battalion. Now, there's quite a lot of profiles here, but the ones that we are generally going to be most interested in a line Kazakh fire team are the MSV-1 AP Sniper, and very occasionally maybe the Heavy Rocket Launcher or AP Spitfire. These guys are amongst the best guns that you can cost effectively add to a Line Kazakh fire team, and there's really nothing wrong with a 3-person core consisting of a single Line Kazakh and a Frontovic Sniper and Colonel Voronin. There's nothing particularly remotely outstanding about this thing as a gun. Ballistic skill 12 is a limitation, but mimetism -3 and the visor on the sniper profile and Warhorse are all kind of meaningful. It's armor 2. It's fine, and it's half an SWC. And you will find yourself often spending SWC in Tartary Army Corps. There are some very attractive options that use either a little or a lot. And so having a half an SWC and a 1 SW gun here, totally fine. You will also find Frontovics in a few other fire teams, and those are kind of the places where we see things like the engineer or the paramedic usually being the cheapest specialist, see just a little bit more play, and we'll mention those when we get to those fire teams. Overall, a Frontovic is a piece that I almost always want to cut from my lists, but basically can't. It is the quintessential eat your vegetables kind of element. It's the only MSV ARO in the faction, and sometimes you just need those. Sometimes you need an active turn sniper, particularly in radial deployment scenarios that have emerged in ITS 17. And you're able to get link bonuses from pieces that are very easy to take or which you're taking in a list already. You might just have 2 Line Kazakhs because one's your LT and one's a decoy, and so the opportunity cost for getting a Frontovic into a link is nil. And that means that even though the Frontovic is otherwise kind of just fine, you get force multiplication cost at very low opportunity cost, and so it should be something you consider whenever you're building lists. Now, the other option for a gun in a Line Kazakh link, and much more expensive but obviously more powerful, is the Veteran Kazakh. These guys can also form a veteran fire team. One of these and a Frontovic is a pure fire team duo. And if you want to run a durable linked big gun with any kind of visual modifier, this is basically the option in faction. Now, the thing about veteran Kazakhs is that they have so many skills, all of which do ultimately cost points. Especially things like combat instinct and sixth sense and terrain total and the ability to medikit them, which you will almost never do because there are no wound incapacitation troop. All of those things kind of cost a little bit on the trooper, all of which makes it very easy to look at this model and go, wow, that's so many rules, when ultimately what you've actually got here is a ballistic skill 13, armor 4, BTS 3, functional 2 wound, mimetism 3, AP HMG. And that's fine. That's a fine big gun, but it is 45 points and 1.5 SWC, and 45 points is a lot of points. And one of the things that we will find as we go through more and more of these troop entries is that there's a lot of stuff in this faction that is not expensive, but not cheap. There's lots of things that are 26 or 28 points, which are very appealing and which we want lots of. And you can absolutely get a lot of those pieces in a list if you don't spend almost 50 points on a single trooper. And so in many lists, the Veteran Kazakh is going to be a little bit crowded out by cheaper but not cheap things that you kind of want in numbers, and of which you'd usually need to cut 2 to afford him. Absolutely not a bad profile on his merits, just kind of be aware that he is a piece where the opportunity cost begins to mount up. If you can afford one, however, 6-2 move is excellent, the AP HMG is excellent, and you might even consider the forward observer piece, although for my money without armor piercing, the T2 rifle is a little anemic as a gun. Overall, a solid and serviceable profile with usually maybe one more luxury skill than you necessarily want, but a fine option to have in faction to reach for occasionally when the scenario, for example, demands it. Now, our next most common model to add to a Line Kazakh link, and in fact a wild card, is Colonel Yevgeny Voronin of the Cossack Diplomatic Corps, and this guy is going to be your lieutenant relatively often. He's the specialized lieutenant profile in the faction, and he has willpower 14, counterintelligence, and strategos, and +1 command token. Now, the +1 command token, not something you necessarily make tremendous use of, but this is a faction that will be repairing remote presence models a lot, so it is nice to have. But mostly this is just willpower 14, counterintelligence, and strategos for 22 points. Very serviceable. Not quite best in class, but pretty close. And being second best behind Kestrel at something usually means you're actually really very good. And I put this guy in a lot of my lists. Of the 2 profiles, my personal recommendation is the Light Shotgun +1 Burst Flash Pulse. The T2 boarding shotgun is a cute profile, but at close range you're actually often going to be using guard. Like if you're trying to defend yourself against an impersonation model, for example, you'll usually find he's going to sick the dog on them because it's a much more powerful defensive element. And so having that flash pulse, given it's the same cost as the T2 boarding shotgun, having the flash pulse just gives him another role to play and a better defense against attacks emerging from outside 8 inches. Ultimately, your goal is that he never gets seen at all the entire game. He sits in the rear with the gear giving orders. And apart from being your lieutenant, the main thing that he does is that he is a wild card who counts as a line Kazakh. And so if you have Voronin and a single line Kazakh and one other thing, for example, a Frontovic, you can form a line Kazakh 3-person corps. And especially if you're using a Frontovic, that also counts as a line Kazakh. And so you can just have the two of them run off into the distance and leave Yevgeny behind. And while you wouldn't be able to reform the link if, say, it broke, one of them went down and was paramedic back up, cool, that's a 2-person corps running off and doing some useful things, which he's contributed to. Very nice, very useful, well worth the 22 points. Not a mandatory pick. There are absolutely some other lieutenant options in the faction, including the Line Kazakh, but just a good thing to have and a really nice contributor to the faction. Special note, particularly with regards to Strategos, the 2 reserve drops in this faction can be hilarious. When we get up to Vistrals, which are one of the premier direct defensive pieces in this faction and indeed the game, just give some thought to how interesting it can be to slam down 2 of them as your reserve pieces after you've seen all the possible lines of advance your opponent might be taking. Very valuable ability in addition to everything else that he does. Now, finally, just to mention it here, the Conductor Trans-Tartaric Railway Troops. We're going to mention them here because technically they can be part of a Line Kazakh fire team, even though in practice you usually won't. There are basically 2 rules that you can use conductors for. The first is that they are a 7-point chain rifle light shotgun shock mine profile, which is just a really good cheerleader. You can slap them in either combat group. If you've got a spare order, they can lay a mine. They defend eminently serviceably, and theoretically you could put them in a link, but since they don't count as anything, they're not usually going to be doing much good there. The other thing to consider is that there is actually some merit in particular in the camouflage infiltration rifle chaincoat flammensphere. Now, 12 points for a regular order is fine, a little expensive, more than we'd usually play in Ariadne, but as one more thing in the midfield, even if it's obvious what it will be, because Ariadne has very few camouflage markers that don't have mimetism, that's still a piece that your opponent has to go, okay, that thing's got a flammensphere and a chain colt, so it's 12 points. It's watching this weird long diagonal line. I guess I have to dig it out at some point. That's kind of valuable. And if you need to downgrade one of your skirmishing elements to save some points, there are worse things than taking that 12-point conductor. I wouldn't take it particularly often, but it's one of those interesting little outside profiles that's worth bearing in mind as existing. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that I've spent most of the last 10 minutes damning this faction with faint praise. Veronin's quite good. All of the rest is meh, it's okay and fine. And to an extent, that would absolutely be true, but it's really all because the Line Kazakh link is not where the strengths of the fire teams in Tartary Army Corps lie. It's in the other fire teams, notably the Gunnery and Mobility fire teams. And so let's take a look at the first of those and start seeing some real strengths begin to emerge. And we see the strengths of the Gunnery fire team, which can be a duo or a Haris, begin with the Vistral Mobile Artillery Regiment. Now, there are 3 profiles here, but the one that we're most going to be interested in is the 26-point Neurokinetics profile. You can take either of the others, consider the portable autocannon to be an upgrade if you've got the 6-point spare, but we're mostly interested in the AP sniper rifle and light rocket launcher, which gives you very good range bands all the way from 8 inches out to however far a sniper rifle can shoot, with neurokinetics for full burst in ARO, and the ability to link for +1 special die. Now, everything else about the Vistral is built around maximizing the advantage of that linkable firepower. The profile is almost entirely anemic except for all of the rules that are very, very important to the things that it's doing as a defensive piece. Ballistic skill 12, good enough. Willpower 12, don't care. Armor 2, BTS 0. That's okay, but it's got 2 structure, so it is a 2 wound near total reaction bot with serviceable ballistic skill and BS attack SR-1, BS attack shock, Sapper, and remote presence. Sapper is the really important rule there. Sapper is an incredible rule on a sniper anyway, because it allows you to deploy in maximally flexible locations, in particular, making maximal use of the distance in your deployment zone. Very often, if you're using a piece like this and the table is open enough, you will park this thing on your back table edge. nothing is going to outrange it, and it will become very common for enemy things like heavy machine guns or even Feuerbachs to start struggling with range bands and need to close in a little before they can engage it properly. And when they engage it, it's just a nightmare. It's Sapper, so it has mimetism. It's firing 3 dice back at ballistic skill 12, and because it's got 2 wounds to structure, it's really difficult to put down efficiently. I have had games with these pieces where they have blown through 3/4 of my opponent's active turn firepower before they finally began to get put down. And once they get put down, no problem, they're a remote presence remote in a faction with access to 8-point engineers. And this means that your opponent is often going to be incentivized to spend further orders trying to destroy the Vistral after it's been knocked unconscious, which means that permanently putting even one of these guys down can just suck away an entire first turn of your opponent. I am a massive fan. I will usually take both of the available 26-point profiles. You can cut down to just one, and that's fine, but at least one of these should almost always be in attack list, and frankly consider two much of the time. They are a core strength, they are incredibly interesting to play, and while there are absolutely more powerful individual ARO pieces in the game, right, like a linked Crux Knight missile launcher, a Swiss Guard missile launcher, these are more powerful individually than a Vistral. A Vistral is like half the points cost of some of these pieces. And that makes it just incredibly efficient and one of the best things in Tartary Army Corps, unique in Tartary Army Corps in that it can form that gunnery fire team. Now, to form the fire team, you can absolutely just use 2 Vistrals, but you can also link with some other things, and it's quite a good idea to link them with maybe one other thing in order to preserve link team bonuses when the first Vistral goes down. Those can include things like a Dozer, who counts as gunnery, or a Barsuk Territorial Defense Regiment, who's a 10-point dude who counts as gunnery. That's him on screen now, basically just a US Ariadne grunt. Nothing wrong with him, 10 points, cheerleader, and he can be used as link glue. The other thing that we might consider linking with the Vistrals are tractor mules. Now, tractor mules have been around for a very long time. The tractor mule courier regiment is unique to MRRF and Tartary Army Corps, and it's the profile we're going to focus on, but it's worth considering that if you ever need to just downgrade the tractor mule, you need to save a bunch of points. There are effectively just cheaper versions of these guys available in the generic tractor mule regiment. Basically just the same thing, that's it on screen now, with worse stats and fewer rules, but costing far fewer points. Both of them can be linked, both of them count as gunnery, and so keep your fire team bonuses alive. But it's the courier that is particularly interesting, because in the courier we can see actually a couple of quite valuable profiles, with the Katyusha being the more common of the two. Now, don't discount the courier Uragan. A lot of the things we're going to talk about the Katyusha being able to do, the Uragan can as well, and it's a total reaction bot, and I will always have a soft spot in my heart for a piece that looks like a SAM site and absolutely fucks up GoPods. But while the Uragan can itself declare Specfire, it's the Katyusha that we're interested in because of how powerful that Specfire is. Now, 1 SWC and 15 points, not cheap, but you do get a bunch of ancillary things for that. You get a mine layer, and while it's a deployment zone bound mine layer, trust me that there are definite uses for camouflage markers in your deployment zone as part of an obfuscation game. And it has Warhorse, which is useful to have. And it can perform ballistic skill attack guided, which means that if you have moved forward one of your forward observers and your opponent has declared discover and you forward observed in response, cool, you've got some good quality guided to respond with now. Linked guided, no less. But while all of this stuff, right, like Warhorse and baggage especially, Mine Layer, these are useful, what we're really taking this for, well, actually, we're partially taking it for baggage, but what apart from baggage that we're really taking it for is the ability to perform some of the highest value spec fire attacks in the game. And we're making those for a few reasons. Now, Ballistic Skill 11 is not incredible, but the Courier's range bands radically change how well it performs as a Specfire vehicle. This is the only thing in the entire game, sharing with the Uragan, that has a positive +3 range modifier out to 24 inches, and then after that, it's got a 0 range band out to 40. That puts it immediately in the same category as linked X-Visor grenade launchers, and in fact, it's better than them at those shorter ranges. And 24 is very permissive. It usually won't hit your opponent's deployment zone unless you ruddle this thing forward, and you generally won't do that. But it absolutely will drop rockets on the heads of things who've moved into the midfield on a +3, which means you're hitting on 8, which by Specfire standards is very good. And that Specfire gets made better by the fact that it's firing double action rounds, excellent, And you've also got the ballistic skill attack -3 skill, which means dodging it is criminally difficult. Your average line trooper is going to be dodging this thing on a 4, which basically means that they will almost always fail the dodge, and in those occasions where you hit, cool, you landed a deflection round on their heads. And the quality of that spec fire is such a big deal, because it actually starts reaching a point where, considered over an entire turn, it's more efficient than guided fire. Now, once you have set up all of the infrastructure you need and made the rolls you need to launch a guided missile, yeah, absolutely, a guided missile is more effective than a single rocket fired by a courier. But if we think about what needs to go into the process of firing a guided missile, particularly in active turn, you need to move the model that has the pitcher and then fire the pitcher. Now, you might do that in one order, but pitcher range bands are a little less forgiving these days. But even optimistically, assume you do it in one order. And then you've got to make the spotlight attack, which generally speaking will take a little bit of time. Spotlight is kind of a serviceable offensive tool with 2 dice, but it's not something you really want to be doing in active turn. It's more reactive. But if you need to make a guided attack, okay, then we need to spotlight. And even if we optimistically assume that the process from going to get the pitcher down to get the targeted landed takes 3 orders, which is going to be pretty good luck in many circumstances, 2 is the bare minimum, only then on the 3rd or 4th order of the turn are you actually firing a guided missile. And if you compare the odds of getting a kill with a guided missile compared to the odds of getting a kill with 4 speculative attacks, particularly if we're targeting something in the midfield where the courier has a range band advantage, then all of a sudden the math actually really significantly shifts toward the courier. And all of that is to say nothing of the fact that the infrastructure you needed to build into a list to get those guided missile attacks is usually going to be like 2 or 3 troop slots and an awful lot more than 15 points, whereas the courier, we're paying 15 points, and part of the reason why we're paying those points is to get baggage and a mine layer, and something to link a Vistral with. Then the value proposition of the courier, or the tractor mule if you need to save some points, is really high. And that makes this model just a really significant strength of the faction. Not necessarily something that you always expect to get use out of, but if you play enough games with this, you will see the value add up. It'll be worth the 15 points much of the time just for baggage and mind layer, but over time, as you spend 1 or 2 orders a turn that you had spare making these attacks, and you get a kill each game, maybe 2, on something that's kind of important, or you burn a bunch of orders through this to bail yourself out of a game, killing a piece that otherwise you had no business dealing with, a black air on a rooftop, for example, then you get all of a sudden a really strong value proposition. Do not sleep on tractor mule couriers. If you are playing Tartary Army Corps, it is my strong recommendation that your initial lists at minimum always include at least one. This is a piece that you need to get your head around learning to play with this faction so you can properly understand the strengths that the faction has access to, even if subsequently you decide you don't need one of them. Maybe this list doesn't call for, maybe you're doing something different. Start with these guys, they're very powerful to have access to. Speaking of things that are very powerful to have access to, our second really high value fire team in Tartary Army Corps is the Mobility Link. And generally speaking, that's going to be comprised of 2 dynamos. Now, these guys are just par excellence. They're absolutely fantastic. You can also access them in Vanilla Ariadne, where they can also link, and you should take them there as well. And they are just extremely valuable because they, for very few points, fulfill a significant number of roles. Now, looking at the profile, 8-4 move, that's Ariadne and bike standard, a little bit slower than some bikes, but still very fast. Ballistic skill 12, excellent. And otherwise, basically just standard kind of infantry stats, but because they're mounted on a motorcycle, they've got limited, not no, limited cover, mimetism 3, the impetuous rule, which you can take advantage of, but my recommendation usually is to keep them linked, and then dogged. We've got 3 profiles, all of which are kind of useful, but as a starting point, I would usually recommend a duo of the 14.0 SWC submachine gun Panzerfaust smoke grenade launcher and the 1.5 SWC 16-point paramedic boarding shotgun smoke grenade launcher. You can spice things up by adding in an AP Spitfire for 25 points. It's absolutely not bad, it's also often not necessary. And the reason why it's not necessary is that these guys already do just a ton of different things. In a single 2-person team, the roles that we can cover on a battlefield begin with some of the best support in the game. 2 of these guys in a fire team give you access to extremely cheap linked ballistic skill 12 smoke. That would almost be worthwhile by itself, but on top of that, they've got mine dispensers. Each of them has a mine dispenser, and this is a faction that can be swimming in baggage, which means that in any given turn, if you just set aside 2 orders, you have 2 mine dispensers to fire off with special die on one of those mines, which lets you very efficiently either slam a bunch of material out into the midfield or contribute to the attack paths of other pieces. And that's actually really valuable. Being able to move 8 inches, draw a line of sight not to an enemy but to some ground near them, and drop a mine or 2 in that space is something that, like, okay, things have been able to do that for a very long time, but if we think about the offensive mix in Tartary Army Corps, a lot of it's good, but it isn't necessarily great. Maybe the burst isn't fantastic, maybe the ballistic skill isn't fantastic, and one of the ways that you can really augment offensive firepower is just by putting a couple of mines down next to the thing that you're about to shoot. Yes, it requires an additional order to set up, but usually only requires 1 order because of how fast the dynamos are, and you give yourself just such a better attack by remotely creating that fork in your opponent's ARO decision, which just makes things very difficult for them. In fact, you can even combine these quite efficiently with speculative fire from the courier. Just land a couple of mines next to something and then spec fire them. Is your opponent going to not dodge? Because if your opponent doesn't dodge, well, they won't set off the mines, but the mines will still be there, and then the tractor mule is landing hits against something that isn't dodging. If your opponent does dodge, well, then they detonate the mines regardless of whether or not the courier lands its hit. And so you create this real rig your opponent's shoes to explode and then tell them to dance situation. That would be excellent. Like that all of the value proposition I've just said would be excellent, but we're not done yet. There's a paramedic in that duo, and it's a very fast linked ballistic skill 12 paramedic, and this is Ariadna, so there's plenty of high fizz to paramedic things with. Being a paramedic also means you have a linked 8-4 specialist. That's fantastic. It's specialist with smoke, which means that once you've got things under control, you've got your defenses established, you've thrown out some mines, let's just go and do some mission stuff with this duo. Smoke grenade, run up, grab a thing, and run away. Fantastic. And if all of that wasn't enough, they are a great assault regiment. Now, I would usually not expend them on this because there is so much value elsewhere, but if there's a line, or if you need to, they've got limited cover, not no cover, mimetism, dogged, boarding pistols, and good short-range weapons. Just attack. Just go and kill your opponent if you need to. Enemy light infantry fire team clustered up and you don't want to spec fire them, stuff you need to face check your opponent's defenses. They're running a big camouflage setup. You can just do so many things with these, from the offensive to the utility to the scenario, that 2 dynamos should basically be in probably every single Tartary Army Corps list. Which 2 will change? If you don't need a specialist, you can easily just go 2 of the cheap ones. If you want to do some gunfighting, you could splash in an AP Spitfire. Fill your boots, because the core elements, right? The smoke grenade launchers, the mine dispensers, the boarding pistols, they're common to everything, so you can flex this link as you need. The only reason why we probably wouldn't necessarily take more is that the best regiments I've mentioned so far are Veronin and Couriers and Vistrals and Dynamos. And if we're taking any kind of AVA of all of those, we're looking at like 6 Silhouette 4 bases in a list. Now, it's not as bad as it sounds. One of the really nice things about how Tartary Corps actually plays is that very few of those pieces compete for the same space. The Vistrals have got Sapper, they can kind of go wherever. The Courier wants to be a little bit forward and nestled so that it's projecting its baggage aura and making spec fire. Veronin wants to be as far back as possible just so that he's safe, and then your dynamos, the 2 dynamos that you will usually take, can find space in and around that. You can take more than 2 dynamos. You could take 3, you could feasibly even take 4, but it's once you hit that 3rd and 4th dynamo that, okay, we might possibly have too many Silhouette 4 models, that's when that begins to emerge. Not the end of the world, but there is a practical limitation just in terms of deployment that you need to consider. That is why we're not going to see, say, more than 2 of these in the sample list at the end of the video, as good and useful as they are. On top of that, we are ultimately limited by troop slots, and there's enough good things in this faction that eventually you have to make sacrifices somewhere. But Dynamos, cannot recommend them highly enough. Truly excellent pieces. There are some other things that can join the mobility link if you want. And so for completeness, we will mention the Armata 2 Ratnik, even though this is a piece that I'm not hugely reaching for, but it is fine. It is the super heavy infantry in Tartary Army Corps. It's 2 wounds with transmutation and dogged, so it can sort of be 2.5 wounds some of the time, although it does definitely fall off, particularly in terms of its movement going down to a very slow 4-2 once it is transmuted. It's also only ballistic skill 13, although it does natively have ballistic skill attack +1 burst, which means that if you're taking the AP Spitfire profile, you do have the special joy, if you link this, of throwing 6 dice into your opponent. And the thing about 6 dice is that you're going to roll something basically good at some point. I have not played with the Ratnik particularly much, but I have played against it many times, and my experience is that it almost always does something, but doesn't always do something worth 41 to 46 points. I have experimented running it as part of a mobility Haris, where its job is to shoot the dynamos forward, but ultimately what I found is that I didn't want to shoot the dynamos forward, and they were fine working as a duo, and they didn't need this 46-point lug following them around, and in fact they wanted to stay back, and he wanted to go forward, and if you're going to do that, you want a different friend for him. The different friend I would suggest is actually a Frontovic, who counts as a Ratnik. It's a specialist. You could take an engineer for 26 points or a paramedic for 23 points. You then have tactical awareness on a fire team with a specialist and a big gun that's firing lots of dice. And that's basically totally fine, although it is more than 70 points, and 70 points can buy many peanuts. And so, unless you're looking to do something particularly specific, for example, maybe play a high order count list, this is the only tactical awareness order in the faction apart from Antipodes, which we shall not consider. The Ratnik is generally going to be an acquired taste, a little bit like the veteran Kazakh, which it competes for very heavily on points. But if you're in the mood to take a reasonably durable, hackable heavy infantry, who randomly, incidentally, has a deactivator, and a bunch of different guns it can fire at different range bands, the rocket pods are totally fine. Firing off 2+1 dice Panzerfaust and Flammenspears is serviceable in a pinch. I'd consider the Ratnik more of a flashy kind of vanity piece, but not outside the realms of consideration. It is something you can take in some lists, just not something that I'd be taking particularly, as it doesn't play to the strengths of tack that I personally like. Bear in mind it exists, not coming with my personal recommendation, but totally fine. Now, with all of our links spoken for, it's now time to get into the entire other half of Tartary Army Corps, which is the awesome shit with camouflage. And there's a lot of this to cover, but we're going to start with one of 2 signature revenant regiments, the Ariadne Scouts. These guys have been in the game basically forever, and they have never been better than they are now. I've kind of always been a little bit of an Ohotnik fan, but I was willing to accept that was kind of a vanity piece. Probably no more. These guys are expensive, but what do we get for our points? 4-4 movement, ballistic skill 12, that's solid. Fizz 13 is nice. You could over-infiltrate these guys, but you usually wouldn't. Willpower 13, armor 1. Okay, totally normal so far. Where does the spice come from? Well, they are infiltration, camouflage, and mimetism. They've got surprise attack and ballistic skill attack AP. And that ballistic skill attack AP is particularly important because all of them are armed with T2 weapons. Most of them have Ohotniks, which have incredible range bands, burst 2 and fire T2 rounds. We've also got some options either for a T2 sniper or a T2 boarding shotgun. I will generally recommend the Ohotnik profiles. T2 armor piercing on the same bullet means that in both active and reactive, these guys are capable of putting down heavy infantry in one shot, killing single wound, including no wounding cap single wound infantry, in one shot. And while they're only burst 2, you've got surprise attack and mimetism, and very advantageous range bands on your side, which means that scouts have to be played in a kind of specific way, but are an eminently serviceable skirmishing gunfighter unit if you need to, and can even be considered as an ARO piece in an absolute pinch. It's totally fine to deploy scouts in positions that might be mines or might be scouts, and which have got long cross-board positions, and if your opponent doesn't respect them and they walk out of cover, take the shot. It's 1 dice on 15s and it could kill a HI. The damage and danger of those weapons also means that if you move the scouts forward, and they're fine at making attacks, right? The Ohotnik scouts are literally good at every range band from 0 out to 32 inches, because at shortest range bands, they've still got their silenced pistols. You can move these guys forward, and if someone risks a discover, shoot them, probably kill them. Now, all of that would be useful by itself, but there are some very, very good profiles, in particular the mine layer and forward observer profiles for other purposes. Now, these are the most expensive for the scouts, coming in at 28 points, which is not cheap, but you will want to afford these guys. The forward observer is your only infiltrating specialist. You've got some forward deploying specialists in the form of things like Strelok and even the Sacha or Pavel if you need to. More on this guy later. But radial deployment scenarios, in particular provisioning, really like something that isn't just forward deployment, but is in fact infiltrating. Having an infiltrating specialist means you can grab the side objectives in provisioning quickly and easily, and you can't do that with something like a Strelok, which makes the forward observer quite appealing, in addition to the fact that it's just a serviceable skirmishing gunfighting piece. It's got shock mines and it's got decharges, and there are quite a few scenarios that, like, well, okay, corporate appropriation really likes having decharges, and there's one classified that calls on them. They're also an elite troop, by the by, so there's a few classifieds these guys can do. The other profile, and this really is the flagship scout profile, is the Mine Layer 2 with EM mines. This is probably the best mine layer in the entire game. Now, there is competition, right? There are a few other mine layer 2 profiles. There's the Shujay in Hackislam, there's the Zensha in Invincible Army, and a few other factions. And while these are both excellent, for my money, I think I would prefer the Scout over either, although it is very close. The Zensha is much more expensive, and while she's a heavy infantry, she's kind of awkward at actually gunfighting. And while the Shujay is very, very marginally cheaper at 27 points and is a very cool ambush piece, the fact that it only has hidden deployment, doesn't have camouflage, kind of limits some of its utility. It's still very, very good. The Shujay is excellent. And at its absolute best, when it's able to perform those ambush attacks, it's fantastic. But if you just need an order on the table, well, the Scout deploys as a camouflage marker. And adding a camouflage marker to the existing sea of camouflage markers, and the potential that that camouflage marker might have a no hotnick, there is just a total value there, a synergy between all of the different things that are going on that is just really, really useful. And the EM mines in particular are really valuable. Now, one of the things you'll occasionally see is people saying, "Oh, I should just take 4 scouts with EM mines in a faction." No, don't do that. 1 or 2 is the correct number, because the thing about mines generally kind of have diminishing returns, but EM mines especially, it is easy to build yourself into a monoculture without realizing it. Electromagnetic mines stall out some of the heaviest attack pieces in the game. Tags and vehicles and super heavy infantry and linked heavy infantry. Even rapid offensive units that might not be subject to hacking still don't like being isolated because it stalls them in their tracks. That's excellent. But there are also plenty of things in the game that literally don't give a shit about electromagnetic mines. If you're playing Tartary Army Corps and you've got a duo, or more accurately, 2-person corps leaving Vronin behind, of a Frontovic and a Line Kazakh, you can just walk the Frontovic through the minefield and have the EM mines detonate on him, and he doesn't care because he's an unhackable warhorse. You can run into Morats and have a single impetuous troop blow up half of your minefield to no effect. And so my personal recommendation is that the threat of the EM mines is more valuable than the reality of them some of the time. You still want that threat, but you get that by having even just 1 scout mine layer. 2 if you're feeling very generous. You do not need 3 or 4 unless you are consistently playing against the same opponent and know what they're always going to be taking, and know that it includes no warhorses. However, with that caveat, 2 or 3 scouts, 1 or 2 of which is a mine layer, outstanding choice, very dangerous, very good, very cool, and a defining factional strength. And before we cover a few other things with like forward deployment, etc., we should cover the far other end of the deployment zone camouflage, and mention the Tank Hunters Regiment. Now, there are a lot of profiles here, and actually a number of them are viable, but there's one that we're going to talk about really in particular. Ballistic Skill 13, Armor 3, Mimetism 3, Surprise Attack -3. Okay, cool. That's reasonably solid. Particularly being Ballistic Skill 13 is very nice. That starts giving you a pretty good chance at landing, say, 2 hits out of 3 if you roll 3 dice against someone. It gives you a very good chance at scoring 1 hit if you roll 2 in ARO. Why would you be rolling 2 dice in ARO? This isn't a linkable model because of the autocannon profile. Portable autocannon, +1 special die. Now, 36 points is not cheap, but ho, damn. That's a gun. That is a real gun in both active and reactive. Going from burst 2 to burst 3 gives you a really good chance of landing at least 1 hit, or burst 1 to effective burst 2 in ARO, and a portable autocannon only needs to land 1 hit. It fires explosive armor-piercing rounds, and you can nestle this guy in and amongst a number of other mines in your deployment zone. You'll have things like decoy from Strelox. It's totally fine to just bud a decoy off and put it in your deployment zone. in a position that a tank hunter might occupy. You'll have mines from couriers. If they share a combat group with a tank hunter, just put mines in a position where they might look like a tank hunter. And so you can use those camouflage markers to build a fog of war, not just in your forward positions, but also in your DZ, and have that fog of war in your DZ conceal one of the scariest ARO pieces in the entire game. Like, this guy, in terms of the damage he can inflict, is within spitting distance of a Swiss Guard missile launcher, and that's incredible. In fact, in active turn, he's also kind of comparable because of the extra dice. And while 36 points is expensive, we are comparing him to pieces that are far more than that. This is a really, really cool profile. It isn't a profile you have to take in every game. 36 points and 1.5 SWC is still expensive. It isn't a profile you have to take multiples of, although I have run a list with 2 of them. It was very amusing. But as a hybrid offensive and reactive piece, it's extremely cool, and it's something that at minimum you should use occasionally so that you can just bud off a Strelok decoy and put it in your deployment zone occasionally and force your opponent to worry about that. Now, there are some other profiles as well that we could consider here. You could take the AP-HMG, but I basically never would over the portable autocannon. The extra burst is good, but the autocannon is an autocannon. Kind of similarly, you could take the missile launcher, but the +1 special die on the autocannon, I think, justifies the significant upgrade cost. The interesting profiles here that aren't the autocannon are while we get to the other things, the mind layers. There's a lieutenant profile if you're ever playing a scenario that really needs you to protect the lieutenant. Being in a marker state and having good stats is good. But we can also consider chain of command. Chain of command is when you're playing Veronin, for example, a relatively high value skill. You should usually be able to defend Veronin, but it's something to consider. And 25 points is not an unreasonable premium, and because it's a mine layer, if you're combining it with another tank hunter with an autocannon, hey, more camouflage markers in the deployment zone. Finally, the forward deploying pace is interesting because it adds an AP mine to your midfield, and it's nice to be able to layer not just EM mines, but also AP and shock mines, and it's a ballistic skill 13 Panzerfaust or AP submachine gun. And being able to just threaten that kind of like like diagonal or lateral ARO against something crossing a line en route to your deployment zone, being able to respond with a Panzerfaust on 16s from an Armor 3 model is potentially high value. It's also a much more dangerous attack piece thanks to ballistic skill 13 and armor piercing rounds than something like a Strelok, for example, but at 24 points, I'm a little reluctant to really heavily lean on it. It's just a profile kind of to be aware of. A lot of what you're taking in the midfield is going to be a mix of scouts and Streloks. Scouts because they're expensive and good, Streloks because they're cheap. Tank hunters will generally be present in the lowest numbers, but they are dangerous and very cool, and really it is the autocannon profile that we are most here for. Now, having mentioned them, let's cover them. Streloks Kazakh reconnaissance units. Light infantry, and extremely budget skirmishers who have the primary utility of forward deployment 8 inches, mimetism 3, camouflage, and decoy. And what that means is that for relatively few points, you can add even more camouflage markers to your already impressive pile, which has significant value because of the danger all of your other camouflage markers pose. And that's a really important thing to recognize about Streloks, is that if you just had Streloks in isolation, right? Like if you played a faction where the only model with camouflage were Streloks, they'd be very close to, well, not useless, but not particularly high value, because your opponent will be able to know what was under all of those camouflage markers with some certainty. But because we're playing Tartary Army Corps, where the camouflage markers could conceal everything from a scout with an Ohotnik, to an EM mine, to an AP mine, to a tank hunter autocannon, to nothing, because it's a Strelok decoy, all of a sudden we get that extra bit of value. We put one more thing on the board that your opponent has to be aware might be hugely threatening and might be nothing, and that's valuable. Now, the Streloks do bring some other value to the table as well. Generally speaking, avoid anything that looks like it's made to fight. The profiles we are most interested in here are probably the Forward Observer for 17 points. It's a Forward Observer, it's forward deploying, and it's 17 points. Since you're probably already taking couriers in a list, you can move this guy forward, and if your opponent declares discover, just forward observe them and then light them up with missiles. Particularly if our budget is constrained and we're only taking, say, 1 or 2 scouts, and those scouts are mine layers, the Strelok is equally good at being a specialist. It's willpower 13, it can move forward and press a button. Particularly given the value we're getting from decoy, 17 points is totally fine for that. The mine layer is valuable because it adds a lethal mine into the mix, but not being a specialist, does definitely kind of hold it back. It's 17-point cheerleader territory whose primary job is to get that single mine out with mine layer and place a decoy. And frankly, those are the two that I will usually use. The K9 Specialist Operative profile falls into the category of probably worth playing with once, but it's also very telegraphed. There's nothing else in the entire faction that could be a Silhouette 5 Images and 3 Camouflage marker in the midfield, and while the K9 Antipode itself is kind of cool and good, 9 points is expensive, and the Strelok that it's stapled to is fairly mediocre. It is a Specialist Operative, that's totally fine. It's not a Forward Observer, so it doesn't have the same options that the Forward Observer Strelok does in terms of enabling Guided, but on the other hand, if you have 9 points spare, and you've already taken a Strelok Forward Observer, there are probably worse things to do than slip that K9 Antipode into your list, if only as yet another defensive element, and occasionally having access to Sensor could be very valuable, and there's not that much of it otherwise in this faction. Don't hate it, usually don't have 9 points spare, but it's a cool piece to at least remember the existence of. Now, just a few other models to go through in this category before we wrap up and move on to independent elements. The Beast Hunter, the 17-point Ariadne one is nice, and it's got forward deployment and is under camouflage, so it will be nestled in amongst a bunch of other things, and having a Panzerfaust and heavy flamethrower and +1 burst heavy pistol inside that massive camouflage markers is quite nice. Again, 17 points means it's competing with quite a few other things, including even just the humble Strelok Specialist, but it is something you can consider. Pavel Alexei McManus, Spetstrooper G, is another kind of piece you can take in that category, and he is effectively just a scout that trades infiltration and cool profiles for forward deployment, frenzy, and pretty good close combat. Now, he is a specialist, and the close combat is pretty good. The combination of Berserk and Camouflage and Surprise Attack and Martial Arts can let you stack, in particular, pretty dangerous initial charge, and a damage 5 AP22 CCW is absolutely capable of connecting, but 33 points is really, really expensive. I don't hate him, but I don't think he does significantly more work than a scout much of the time, even if he is, practically speaking, the best close combat model in the faction. Finally, back in the deployment zone camouflage, we've got Kazakh Spetsnaz. These are fine. In terms of the ability to win a face-to-face roll, a Kazakh Spetsnaz with a HMG is definitely better than a tank hunter autocannon. It's just that it's firing a heavy machine gun, whereas a tank hunter autocannon is firing an autocannon. However, if you want multiple camouflage deployment zone guns, there's a little bit of an argument for having one Kazakh Spetsnaz HMG and one tank hunter, because the Spetsnaz will add a decoy into the mix, and you just don't always need the guns that the tank hunter is bringing. If you're just trying to suppress an enemy, total reaction bot, for example, a Kazakh Spetsnaz is totally fine, even if I'm not reaching for this thing tremendously often, it's fine to have. It's also kind of a close combat model, but an AP CCW damage 7 weapon does not spark joy. Now, if you want a decoy, these are the only options. So decoy. If you want a parachutist, these are the only options in faction. Be aware that at present, decoy doesn't interact with parachutist at all. Like, it doesn't do anything because decoys by definition never activate. So they don't generate AROs, and you can't measure zone of control of them during the active turn, so your opponent will always know which Kazakh is real, so the decoy just doesn't do anything. It doesn't detonate mines, doesn't generate AROs, doesn't trigger defenses, it's functionally a vestigial rule that kind of feels like it was meant to do something, but doesn't, actually. And that leaves you with a kind of good enough parachutist. Definitely recommend the boarding shotgun +1 burst. Having that extra modifier is more valuable than the AP submachine gun. And for 27 points, it's fine. Some missions kind of want you to have a parachutist, but I would frankly say that many of those missions are equally happy having just some good quality infiltrators, and for 1 more point, we could get any of the scout profiles of our choosing, and I'd probably take that over the Kazakh Spetsnaz parachutist. Still, a solid profile to have access to. Consider the HMG or maybe even the sniper occasionally as part of a broader deployment zone camouflaged firepower mix. Now, only a few more models to mention here, and these are kind of our independent and primarily irregular pieces, and we start with the Ermandino. An old school, a staple, a classic. At this point, kind of everyone knows what they do. They are engineers and irregular warbands. Not exactly great in close combat, but hey, they've got a chain rifle and some smoke grenades, and the smoke grenades roll on very good fizz. But in Tartary Army Corps in particular, what the Ermandino is, in addition to being a mobile smoke throwing specialist, it's the cheapest engineer in the game. And we're taking just a bunch of things that we want to repair. So you just give him an electronic peripheral, and there you go. Cheapest engineer, 8 points, can't get better than that. They're remote presence and they reroll. That's the primary purpose of the Omandino, although because of his nature as a warband with a chain rifle who is a specialist and can throw smoke, he will often also just go and do mission things. Very valuable, a core part of the total package when we're building our artillery park. Very useful. Don't leave home without one if you're taking Vistrals. At the other end of the irregular spectrum, we have our most expensive irregular model, the Dogface. Dogface is genuinely pretty solid these days. 21 points is pleasingly cheap, and they have 3 wounds and immunity arm. They're very fast even in human form, they throw smoke very well. Don't really think of them as close combat models despite the CC23. Most of what these guys want to be doing is using their chain rifles, maybe taking a wound, getting in close, and then throwing spec fire. That's right, it's more spec fire time. And spec firing grenades, particularly damage 6 grenades on Fizz 16, is really good. You'll throw those on 13s with the spec fire penalty. And that's very capable, particularly if you get close using your impetuous orders, of doing a fair bit of damage against opponents in the deployment zone. And once that's all done, they're a 3 wound piece with immunity armor. Just good. 21 points is not something you can afford all the time, and there are some other cheaper options we might take in terms of impetuous irregular assault, but a 1 of in lists or even 2 of occasionally, totally serviceable, very cool pieces. Now, in terms of those other cheaper pieces, for 4 points less, we can get Carmen John's Mercenary Biker and Batard, who have advantages and disadvantages compared to a Dog Warrior. Advantage, much cheaper, definitely more dangerous in terms of what it can do on the attack. Carmen herself can fork a chain rifle with a +1 burst AP heavy pistol, which is better than the I'll throw a grenade I guess the Dog Warrior has, and of course she has a synchronized peripheral, Batard, who has both grenades and a trench hammer himself. Just to note, in terms of Specfire, by the way, possibly the most hilarious Specfire in the game is the fact that if you get Batard and Carmen both inside range of an enemy and declare Specfire, both of them perform it, and both of them have grenades, and both of them have good fizz. Like, that's just hilarious, and I want to do that at some point, even if it's not the core use of the two. Collectively, they're also very good in close combat. Carmen's got Dogged, Batard's got its own wound, and Dogged as well. And thanks to how peripheral works in close combat, you can always just take kind of a good or non-face-to-face roll if you want, which will do some damage. You've got either the Trench Hammer or Carmen's own DACCW. Usually you'll be able to inflict 2 hits, possibly even a hit and a crit, which makes them very good at effectively berserking something down. Just generally a whole bunch of damage, and of course if you want a sensor, there are only so many sources of it, and if you aren't taking a linked K9, then Batard has a sensor himself. Downside of Carmen is that, as I mentioned, we're already taking an awful lot of Silhouette 4s, and sooner or later even Tartary Army Corps begins to experience a little bit of deployment zone congestion. A Dog Warrior deploys as a Silhouette 2 and prone, Carmen doesn't. And so if you're taking your Vistrals and your Tractor Mules and Veronin and your Dynamos and then Carmen, do be aware that at some point you might have to make some sacrifices in the DZ, even if in terms of the value she brings at 17 points, exceptional piece. And finally, as we cross on over the hour mark, just for the sake of mentioning them, War Drivers Mercenary Hackers. Your only hacker in the faction. It is a totally fine hacker. It can defend itself a little bit in missions that want a hacker. It is one, and that's fantastic. And it has disco balls, and that's the profile that you take. 16 points and 1 SWC is affordable if a little expensive, but there is really no substitute for Eclipse grenades, and that's what a disco ball is. Sometimes the way to win a game is to just not be seen, and if you want to do that against MSV, you need Eclipse ammunition, and the War Driver provides that. Definitely a niche pick because in Tartary Army Corps you have reasonable active turn guns and lots of camouflage. Camouflage can be used across the table, and lots of regular smoke which will do the job most of the time. But if you're thinking about really covering your bases, for those circumstances where nothing else will suffice, you've got baggage and a War Driver with disco balls. Be aware that it exists, even if it won't appear in too many lists, because it's a very valuable tool to have access to, even if under ideal circumstances you never use it. And with that, let's close out the video with a sample Tartary Army Corps list. And this list is very much written as what we might call Eat Your Vegetables Tartary Army Corps. We're not getting aggressively clever. We're playing to the core strengths, and those core strengths are all present. So we're beginning with that Lion Kazakh 3-person core. We've got the necessary line Kazakh forward observer to form the link, Colonel Voronin, and then a Frontovic multispectral visor. If this team ever needs to move forward, Voronin will stay behind because you get duo bonuses just from the line Kazakh and the Frontovic, but because the Frontovic's got a sniper, most of the time it's just an ARO piece if you need, active turn piece if you need, 28 points. Particularly in scenarios like provisioning or area of interest, this is really valuable to have. It is the quintessential vegetables piece, and so it's present for that reason. We've then got our Dynamo duo, our dynamic duo, if you will, Dynamo Submachine Gun Panzerfaust, Dynamo Paramedic. Because we don't know what we're playing, this is a catch-all. We are not cutting the Dynamo down to just the two 14-point pieces, so the Paramedic is present, so we have a specialist. And they'll be allocated as many orders as they need in a turn to do all of the things we expect of them. Often they will spend 2 out of the available 11 orders in this combat group just to lay some mines. They might spend a third to throw some smoke, or they might spend 8 or 9 to go and attack. We've then got Carmen and Batard, with the caveat that this could very easily be replaced by a Strelok forward observer depending on what you think you need. In this list, I wanted a close assault piece, even though this is a list where there are a lot of silhouette 4 pieces. If you play this list and you find that deploying her and the dynamos is a challenge, consider cutting her, but she is very good and she is very dangerous, and she offers an attack piece that the list otherwise doesn't necessarily have. If you cut her for a Strelok forward observer, then one of the scouts we'll see later can become a mine layer. That could be very valuable, so bear that in mind as an option. We then have one Tank Hunter portable autocannon. It would have been shockingly remiss of me not to include at least one of these in the list. And we're going to be using things like the Strelok's decoy. That Strelok decoy will go back in the deployment zone to give us something that looks like a second Tank Hunter, just to add a little bit of fog of war and confusion. If Carmen and Batard were to become a second Strelok, we would seriously considering also using its decoy to stand on a rooftop somewhere to project a third threat that could be a Tank Hunter and maximize the fog of war this Tank Hunter is protected by. We've then got our camouflage package of a Scout Forward Observer, a Scout Mine Layer, and a Strelok Forward Observer. I wanted 2 specialists because I don't know what this list is going to be played with, what scenarios it will be in, and for that reason, having only 2 specialists that can move forward, the Dynamo and a single Strelok, felt insufficient, so we've got a Scout FO. If you turn Carmen into a Strelok, the Forward Observer Scout can easily become a Mine Layer, and then you have mines for days in the midfield, which is obviously also excellent and entirely viable. In total, though, say we play this in provisions, we've got a Scout Forward Observer to get a side point, we've got the Strelok to get the nearby one, some Mine Layers to defend ourselves, and a bunch of attacking and utility options. All of this forms our primary combat group. It's excellent, it has multiple lines of play, it's got multiple very dangerous pieces in it, it's some core Tartary Army Corps stuff, and the second combat group is equally core Tartary Army Corps stuff. We've got a Conductor FTO. This guy is here just because he generates a regular order. If you wanted to, you could actually take this line Kazakh Forward Observer, turn it into a 9-point line Kazakh, and turn the Conductor into a second Ermandino, if you think you need it. But in this case, we've got one Ermandino with an electronic, and those two collectively are then supporting and repairing 2 Vistrals with Neurocomedics and a Tractor Mule Courier. How this group will spend its orders is pretty set. If you need to repair anything with the Ermandino, you do that first. If you need to throw smoke or press buttons with the Ermandino, you do that second, and any spare orders are spent spec firing with the Courier, which on the first turn is going to be 4 or 5 orders, on subsequent turns may well be the same, or it might just be 1 or 2 orders after the Ermandino has repaired everything that he can. That gives us the speculative fire that I've spent so long harping on about as one of Tartary Army Corps' primary strengths, and the orders needed to do it in every single game. And with that, and the list showcase done, that wraps up our video for this week. Once again, thanks to the channel supporters who voted for this video topic, and to Kerez for providing just an absolute ton of input on Ariadna generally over the last few months. As a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel and vote on topics or suggest topics yourself, you can do so either by becoming a channel member via YouTube or by donating via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description. We cover a number of war games of which Infinity is the primary, and we put out videos about once a week, so big thanks to all of the supporters who make that possible. As always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll be back next week with more Infinity content.